The band is packing up to leave. You can hear it, the scrape of gear, the low voices, a child being lifted onto a hip, and you cannot get up. Your hip has been failing for a season now, and this morning it simply won't take your weight. So you sit in the cold ash of last night's fire, and you watch the people you love decide, without quite saying it, whether you are coming with them. This is the oldest math in the world, in a group where every mouth has to earn its food, where the whole camp survives by walking to the next water, the next herd, the next valley. What happens to the one who can't keep up? You already know the brutal answer nature usually gives. The slow gazelle gets eaten. The old wolf falls behind and starves. For almost every animal that has ever lived, weakness is a quiet death sentence. So here is the question worth sitting with. When you were the weakest person in an ancient tribe, were you carried or were you left? The real answer is both, and which one it was tells us something unsettling about exactly what kind of animal we are. Let's start with what weak even meant out there, because it wasn't an insult. It was a status, and it could happen to anyone. You didn't have to be born frail. You just had to have a bad year. A broken ankle that healed crooked, a fever that left your legs wasted, a pregnancy that went wrong, a run of teeth rotting in your jaw until you couldn't chew, or the slowest emergency of all, you simply got old and the strength drained out of your arms while you weren't looking. And in a hunter-gatherer world, being weak wasn't like being weak today. Today, you can be frail and safe. Back then, your entire existence was built on movement. The group followed food. When the herd moved, you moved. When the water dried up, you walked to the next water, sometimes for days, carrying everything you owned on your back. There were no wheels, no carts, no spare hands that weren't already full of children and gear. So the person who couldn't walk wasn't just unlucky. They were a problem the whole group had to solve over and over every time it was time to go. And the group had exactly two answers. Here's the first answer, and it's the one that will surprise you. Deep in the ground, over and over, archaeologists keep digging up people who should not have survived. People so broken or so old that they could not possibly have fed themselves. And yet their bones show years of healing. Someone kept them alive. Go back almost 2 million years to a site called Dmanisi in the country of Georgia. There, scientists found the skull of an early human, one of the oldest ever found outside Africa. And this skull is famous for what it's missing. Nearly all the teeth are gone, not lost after death, but lost in life. The jawbone had shrunk and healed smooth where the teeth used to be, the way it only does over years. Sit with that. This was a person with almost no teeth. At a time when food meant raw meat and tough roots you had to grind with your own jaw. A toothless human in that world could not eat. And yet they lived on for years after the last tooth fell out, which means someone else did the chewing. Someone softened their food or fed them mush or handed them the tender parts. Almost 2 million years ago, before our species even existed, somebody chose to keep a helpless old creature fed. And it keeps happening down the ages. In a cave in France called La Chapelle-aux-Saints, they found a Neanderthal we call the Old Man, though he was probably only in his 40s. He was a ruin. His spine was bent with arthritis. His hip was worn. He had lost most of his teeth, and again the jaw had healed over the gaps. He couldn't have hunted. He may have struggled to walk. Someone fed that man, sheltered him, and buried him when he died. In Italy, at a site called Romito, there's the skeleton of a young man with a form of dwarfism that left his arms too short to be much use for hard labor in the Ice Age. He lived to adulthood anyway, carried in a sense by a group that had every reason to see him as dead weight and instead saw him as one of their own. So the picture forming is a warm one. Our ancestors were kind. They carried their weak, case closed. Except that's only half the bones in the ground, because the same species that carried its weak also sometimes walked away and left them to die. Here's the part we don't like to say out loud: care costs. Carrying a grown adult who can't walk through days of hard travel while also carrying your children and your tools and your food, that isn't a warm feeling. It's a physical load measured in calories and hours and risk. And in the good years, when the herds were fat and the camp was fed, the group could afford it. But the years were not always good. We know this because a few human groups survived into modern times, still living the old way, and anthropologists lived alongside them and wrote down what actually happened. Among the Ache, a hunter-gatherer people of Paraguay, researchers Kim Hill and Hillard Kaplan recorded something hard. When the band had to move fast, fleeing danger, chasing food, the very old and the very sick could be left behind. Not out of cruelty, but out of a math so old it lived in their bones. The group that stops for the dying can lose everyone. They were not monsters. These were the same people who, in a good season, would carry a hurt companion for weeks. The kindness and the abandonment came from the exact same hands. That's the thing that's so hard to hold in your head. And across many cultures, in the harshest places on Earth, there are accounts of the same terrible choice. The old one who stays behind at the camp when the group moves on, the elder who quietly walks out into the cold so there's one less mouth when the food runs out. Sometimes it was forced. Sometimes, chillingly, it was a choice the weak one made for themselves to save the children. Anthropologists call this kind of thing senicide, and while it was never the everyday norm, in the leanest corners of human history, it was real. So when food ran short, the weakest were often the first left behind. That is the cold half of the truth, and any honest look at the bones has to include it. Now, how can both of these be true? How can the same animal carry a toothless elder for a decade and also leave a dying grandmother in an empty camp? The answer is that our ancestors were doing a calculation, whether they knew it or not. And to see it, you have to stop asking, were they kind or cruel, and start asking, what was the weak person actually worth? Because here's what we get wrong. We picture the weak as pure cost, a body that only takes. But in a world with no books, no writing, no way to store knowledge except inside a living human head, the old and the weak were something we've forgotten how to see. They were the library. The old hunter who can't run anymore is the only one who remembers where the water still flows in a drought, because he saw the last one 40 years ago when everyone alive today was a child or unborn. The grandmother who can't walk still knows which plants stop a fever, which berries are poison, what the sky looked like the year the herds didn't come, and how their people survived it. Keep her fed, and you keep decades of hard-won survival knowledge that no strong young body has had time to learn. There's even a name for part of this. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues call it the grandmother hypothesis, the idea that human grandmothers, by living long past their own childbearing years and helping feed their grandchildren, were so valuable that evolution actually selected for a long old age. We may be one of the only animals that grows old on purpose, because old people were worth keeping. So the weak weren't always carried out of pure love. They were carried because they were useful, because they were owed, because a group that abandons its people breaks the very trust that keeps a group together. And they were abandoned when the math finally tipped. When the food was so short that carrying one more meant losing everyone. And this is where the whole story turns over. We like to imagine ancient humans as simple, either noble savages living in gentle harmony or brutes who threw their weak off cliffs. The truth is stranger and much more human than either. Our ancestors were the first creatures on Earth capable of both. The same species that invented leaving the weak behind is the one that invented refusing to. Think about that. No lion agonizes over the sick cub. No wolf pack carries its crippled elder for years. They don't have the choice because they don't have the imagination for it. But we did. Somewhere back there, a human looked at a body that could give them nothing. A toothless old man, a boy who couldn't hunt, a woman who couldn't walk, and did something no animal had ever done. They ran the numbers. They saw a person where nature saw a burden. And often, they chose to stay. That choice is the thing. Not that we always made it, we didn't, but that we could make it at all. The capacity to look at pure weakness and decide it was worth feeding anyway. That may be the exact moment something stopped being an animal and started being us. Care wasn't the soft edge of human nature. It was the invention that made us human in the first place. So go back to that cold morning, sitting in the ash, listening to your people decide whether you're coming. For most of the animals that ever lived, there was no deciding. Weakness meant the end, quickly and without a thought. You are alive today because again and again, across 2 million years, in caves and on frozen plains and beside drying rivers, enough of your ancestors landed on the other answer. Enough toothless elders got fed. Enough broken legs got carried. Enough weak, useless, doomed people were kept alive long enough to pass down where the water was, and to pass down eventually you. You come from the ones who were worth carrying, and you come just as surely from the ones who did the carrying, who bent under a weight that gave them nothing back, because leaving felt worse than aching. But don't make it too pretty, because you also come from a species that knew, in its bones, how to walk away. That's the deal we've been living with since Dmanisi. We are the animal that can choose to stay, and the animal that can choose to leave, and mostly we just hope the food holds out so we never have to find out which one we'd be. So here's the question worth carrying with you. If the food ran short tomorrow and the band was packing up to leave, would they carry you? And be honest, would you carry them?